Story number 1. Whispers in the Eternal Night. I've never trusted the silence. Not in the way some people find peace in it. No, silence has a weight in Barrow, Alaska, especially in January, when the sun vanishes for weeks and the world is swallowed by an endless night. I didn't grow up here, but my wife, Laura, insisted this town was where we needed to be, where we'd find ourselves. It's good for the kids, she said. They'll learn resilience. Resilience, my ass. I didn't want resilience. I wanted sunlight. The move was her idea. A fresh start after some bad years, marriage fights, job losses, and a miscarriage that hollowed us both out. But when the moving truck rolled up to our snow-smothered rental house, I knew I'd made a mistake. Something about the place felt off. The wind carried a low hum, almost a whisper, as it weaved through the eaves of the house. It made my teeth ache. Our kids, Maddie, 9, and Sam, 6, didn't seem to notice. Kids are resilient, after all. They bounded into the house, their laughter bouncing off the barren walls, but even that felt muted, swallowed by the darkness pressing against the windows. The first night, I thought it was just the wind. I woke up around 2 a.m., the kind of waking where your body jolts as though something's just shouted your name. Laura was snoring lightly beside me, her back turned. The kids' rooms were down the hall, and I strained to hear any sounds of movement. Nothing. But then I heard it, a faint whisper, like someone murmuring just outside the bedroom window. My name. Clear as day. James. I bolted upright, my heart hammering in my chest. Laura? I shook her awake. She groaned, annoyed. What? Did you hear that? She sat up, blinking. Hear what? I listened again. Just the wind, moaning through the darkness. Nothing, I muttered. Go back to sleep. But I didn't. I stayed up, staring at the frost-laced window, convinced that if I looked hard enough, I'd see someone out there. Someone watching. By the third day, the whispers weren't just at night. Maddie came to me while I was unpacking boxes in the kitchen. She clutched her stuffed rabbit, her face pale. Daddy, someone's calling me, she said. What do you mean, sweetheart? She pointed to the window, where snow was piled so high it blocked most of the view. Outside. They said my name. They want me to come play. My stomach twisted. I forced a smile. It's just the wind, Maddie. Nothing to be scared of. But she didn't look convinced, and neither was I. The whispers grew louder as the days passed, more distinct. They called each of us by name, soft and cajoling. Laura tried to laugh it off, but I could see the fear creeping into her eyes, the way her hands trembled when she stirred her coffee. It's just the isolation, she said one night as we sat by the fire, the kids asleep upstairs. It's playing tricks on us. I nodded, but deep down, I knew better. I'd grown up in Boston. I knew the sound of people whispering. This wasn't the wind. The snow came harder that week, burying the house in a white tomb. We couldn't open the front door, and the windows were crusted with frost so thick it looked like etched glass. The isolation was suffocating, the darkness relentless. Then, Sam disappeared. It happened overnight. One moment he was there, tucked into his Spider-Man sheets, his nightlight casting shadows on the wall. The next, he was gone. We tore the house apart. Maddie cried until her voice cracked, and Laura screamed at me like it was my fault. But there was no trace of him. Nothing, except for the words scrawled across the frost on his bedroom window, I was here. The whispers grew louder after that, more insistent. They called Maddie next, then Laura. Each time, the snow seemed to press closer, the walls groaning under its weight. One night, I woke to find Laura standing at the back door, her breath fogging the glass. What are you doing? I demanded. She turned slowly, her eyes glassy. They're out there, she whispered. I can hear them. Sam's with them. I grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her. There's nothing out there. It's the snow, Laura. The wind. But she didn't believe me. I started seeing them after that. Shadows flitting just beyond the edges of the frost-covered windows. They were tall, gaunt figures, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. They didn't knock. They didn't try to come in. They just watched. I set up barricades, shoved furniture against the doors, but it didn't matter. The whispers were inside the house now, curling through the halls like smoke. One by one, they took them. First Maddie, her laughter echoing through the house long after she was gone. Then Laura, her scream swallowed by the night. And then it was just me. I don't know how long I've been here, alone. The snow has buried the house completely, the windows sealed with frost so thick it might as well be stone. They whisper to me still, their voices softer now, almost kind. They tell me to come outside, to join the others. I've started to think maybe they're right. Maybe I've been wrong to fight them. Maybe the darkness isn't something to fear. Maybe it's just another kind of light. When the rescue team finally reached the house in March, they found it empty. The walls were scrawled with frost-covered messages, dozens of them, all the same, I was here. And on the snow-covered hill outside, 5 sets of footprints disappeared into the endless white. Story number 2. The party never ends. It started like any other New Year's Eve, the kind where the air buzzes with promises of a fresh start, resolutions, and too much champagne. My best friend, Tony, said he had a line on the party of the decade at some old mansion in the Garden District of New Orleans. It wasn't hard to convince the rest of the group, Emma, her boyfriend Nate, and Jess, who never met a party she didn't like. I was hesitant at first, but Tony had that grin, the one that said, "Come on, live a little." And maybe I was due for some living. The house loomed at the end of a narrow street, framed by ancient oaks dripping with Spanish moss. It was one of those old plantation-style mansions, with columns that seemed to stretch forever and windows like dark, watching eyes. As we approached, the laughter and music spilling out into the night felt almost alive, drawing us in. A woman in a shimmering silver gown greeted us at the door, her eyes sharp and her smile sharper. "Welcome," she purred, extending a hand. "I'm Antonia. Please, make yourselves at home." The foyer was a masterpiece of excess, crystal chandeliers, gilded mirrors, and a sweeping staircase that seemed to ascend into another world. The air was thick with the scent of bourbon and something floral I couldn't place. Guests swirled around us in glittering gowns and sharp tuxedos, their faces glowing with too perfect smiles. There was something unreal about it, like stepping into a movie set where the lighting was just a little too warm, the people just a little too beautiful. We didn't know anyone, but it didn't matter. Antonia appeared again, holding a silver tray of glasses filled with a golden liquid. "A toast," she said, her voice like velvet. "To new beginnings." We each took a glass. I hesitated, something about the way she looked at us made my skin crawl, but the others raised theirs eagerly. I wasn't about to be the odd one out, so I downed mine in one quick gulp. The liquid burned going down, but it wasn't unpleasant. In fact, it was intoxicating. I felt a warmth spread through me, a heady sense of euphoria. Tony let out a laugh, clapping me on the back. "See? Best party ever," he said. The rest of the night was a blur of dancing, drinking, and laughter. The music was strange, though, old and haunting, like something from another century. Time seemed to slip away. One moment, it was 11:30, the next, it was 11:59. The countdown began, and we all shouted along, 10, 9, 8. When the clock struck midnight, I felt a jolt, like static electricity snapping through the air. The crowd cheered, glasses clinked, and Antonia smiled that too sharp smile. But something was wrong. The clock on the mantel didn't move. It stayed stuck at 11:59, the second hand twitching but never advancing. I pointed it out to Emma, but she just laughed. "You're drunk," she said, pulling me back to the dance floor. The first sign that something was truly wrong came an hour later, or maybe it wasn't an hour. Time felt slippery, elastic. I found Jess standing by the punch bowl, staring into her glass with wide, unblinking eyes. "Jess? You okay?" She turned to me slowly, and my stomach dropped. Her lips were stained red, not from lipstick, but blood. It dripped down her chin and onto her dress. She opened her mouth to speak, but instead of words, a low, guttural groan escaped her throat. Then she collapsed. I screamed for help, but when Tony and Nate came running, Jess was gone. Just gone. No blood, no body. Nothing. "You're imagining things," Tony said, but he didn't look convinced. His eyes darted nervously around the room, as if he expected Jess to reappear any second. And she did. She walked in through the front door, looking perfectly fine, as if nothing had happened. I grabbed her arm, babbling incoherently, but she just stared at me like I was crazy. "What's your problem?" she snapped. I stopped myself. How could I explain something I didn't even understand? The rest of the night unraveled in a haze of déjà vu and terror. Every time the clock hit midnight, the night restarted. We were trapped in an endless loop, reliving the same sequence of events over and over. Each time, something horrible happened. Emma fell down the stairs, her neck snapping like a dry twig. Tony choked on his drink, clawing at his throat as his face turned purple. Nate disappeared into the garden, and we found him hours later, his body hanging from the branches of an oak tree. And then they'd all come back, alive and whole, as if nothing had happened. I tried to warn them, to explain what was happening, but they looked at me like I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. The worst part was seeing myself die. The first time, I tripped on the stairs, cracking my head open on the marble floor. I watched my own body lying there, blood pooling around my skull, before everything reset. The second time, I drank the punch, only to feel my throat close up as if invisible hands were choking the life out of me. Each death was worse than the last, more painful, more drawn out. Antonia was always there, watching with that serpentine smile. I confronted her once, demanded to know what was happening, but she just laughed. "You wanted a fresh start, didn't you?" she said. "Isn't this what you asked for? A new beginning, over and over again." "This isn't living," I spat. "This is hell." "Hell?" She tilted her head, her eyes glittering like a cat's. "No, my dear. This is eternity. There's a difference." I stopped drinking after that. Stopped dancing. Stopped trying to save the others. What was the point? Every loop ended the same way, with death and resurrection, a grotesque parody of life. The party never ended, and neither did the horror. I don't know how long I've been here. Days? Years? Time doesn't mean anything anymore. The clock is still stuck at 11:59, the second hand twitching but never advancing. The others have stopped noticing. They laugh, drink, and dance as if nothing's wrong, their memories wiped clean with each reset. But I remember. I always remember. Sometimes I think about joining them, letting myself forget, losing myself in the endless revelry. But then I see Jess's bloodstained lips or hear the snap of Emma's neck, and I know I can't. I can't let go of the fear, the anger, the desperate hope that there's a way out. Antonia watches me from across the room, her smile never fading. I think she knows I'm close to breaking. Maybe that's what she wants. Maybe that's the point. The party never ends, but one day, I will. Story number 3. The Ghost Train of the Rockies. The train to Denver was supposed to be uneventful. I'd taken this route plenty of times before, cutting through the Colorado Rockies, weaving between the snow-capped peaks like a silver thread against a white canvas. But this time, something felt different. The sky was a dull gray when I boarded, the kind of color that sucked the life out of everything it touched. A storm was coming, but the conductor assured us we'd outrun it. We didn't. By the time we reached the foothills, the snow was coming down in thick, suffocating sheets. The windows fogged up, and the once crisp landscape outside dissolved into a swirl of white. I was seated near the back of the train, watching the trees whip past, when we lurched to a stop. The sudden stillness was almost as jarring as the movement had been. "Ladies and gentlemen," the conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, "we've encountered an unexpected delay. Please remain seated while we assess the situation." The collective groan from the passengers was almost comforting. Delays happen, right? But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then 2, that comfort began to erode. Outside, the snow piled higher, swallowing the world beyond the train. The temperature in the car dropped, and people huddled in their coats. I pulled mine tighter around me and tried not to think about how the heating system seemed to be failing. That's when I saw it, the first shadow. It flickered past the window, quick and dark, like a bird darting between the trees. But it wasn't a bird. Too big. Too human. I blinked, leaning closer to the frosted glass, but all I could see was my own reflection staring back at me. "Did you see that?" I asked the woman across the aisle. She shook her head, not even bothering to look up from her phone. But then there was another. And another. Shadows slipping between the snowdrifts, faint but unmistakable. The whispers started not long after. At first, I thought it was just the wind. A low, mournful sound that seemed to wrap around the train like a shroud. But then the voices became clearer, more distinct. They spoke in hushed tones, too quiet to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading. "Let me out," someone muttered from a few rows ahead. I turned to see a man in a heavy coat pressing his face to the window, his breath fogging the glass. "They're out there." "Who's out there?" someone else asked. He didn't answer. He just kept staring, his hands pressed against the window, as if he could push through the glass and into the storm. The whispers grew louder, filling the train car like an unwelcome draft. Some passengers began to mutter nervously, while others sat in tense silence. I looked around, trying to gauge if anyone else was as unsettled as I was. That's when I saw the first set of handprints. They were smeared across the outside of the window, long and spindly, as if someone had dragged their fingers through the snow before pressing them to the glass. They weren't there a moment ago, I was sure of it. More followed. Handprints on every window, streaking across the glass in uneven lines. Some were small, like a child's. Others were impossibly large, fingers stretching longer than any human hand could manage. And then came the knocking. Soft at first, like the tentative tap of a branch against the window. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it was a frantic pounding that echoed through the train. People began to panic, their breaths coming in quick, visible puffs in the frigid air. The conductor tried to calm everyone down, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos. I pressed my face to the window, heart hammering in my chest, and that's when I saw them. They stood just beyond the edge of the snowstorm, their figures barely visible through the swirling white. Men, women, children, all staring at the train with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, and their mouths moved soundlessly as they gestured toward the train. "Don't look at them," the man across from me whispered. He was clutching a rosary, his knuckles white. "Whatever you do, don't look at them." But it was too late. The train began to shudder, the walls groaning as if something immense was pressing against them. The lights flickered, and for a moment I thought I could hear a distant scream, long and drawn out, like metal tearing apart. That's when the woman across the aisle screamed. She pointed at the window, her face contorted in terror. I turned to look, and my blood ran cold. One of them was on the glass, its face inches from mine. Its skin was stretched too tight over its bones, and its eyes were black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It raised a hand, pressing it to the window, and I could see the flesh shift, as if something was moving beneath the surface. The whispers turned to wails, the sound of countless voices crying out in agony. I stumbled back, clutching the armrest of my seat as the figure outside began to fade, its body dissolving into the storm. The train jolted forward, the lights surging back to life. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom again, but it was shaky, panicked. "We need to move," he said. "Now." The train began to crawl forward, the wheels screeching against the tracks. Outside, the figures followed, their glowing eyes watching us as we crept through the blizzard. I don't know how long we rode like that, the train inching forward while the storm raged around us. At some point, someone pulled out their phone to look up the date. That's when we discovered the truth. January 12th. The anniversary of the Rocky Express disaster. 50 years ago, a train just like ours had derailed in a snowstorm, plunging into a ravine and killing everyone on board. The wreckage had never been recovered. The storm had buried it, along with its passengers, sealing them in a frozen grave. And now they were calling to us. One by one, passengers began to disappear. They'd step into the bathroom and never return. Or they'd get up to check another car, only for their seats to remain empty. By the time we reached Denver, the train was nearly empty. The conductor refused to speak about what happened, his face pale and drawn. I don't think he ever will. I left the train that morning, stepping into the harsh light of a new day, but I can't shake the feeling that I left a part of myself behind. I still hear the whispers sometimes, in the dead of night when the wind howls outside my window. And sometimes, when the snow falls just right, I see the handprints. Story number 4. The Forest of Whispers. I always thought the Adirondacks were beautiful. Miles of untouched wilderness, the kind of place that felt like it could swallow the rest of the world and not even notice. But beauty can be a mask, can't it? I didn't understand that until January, when my brother Tom disappeared. Tom wasn't the kind of guy who got lost. He'd been hunting those woods since we were kids, first with Dad, then on his own when he got older. He loved it out there, called it his cathedral. The only church I'll ever need, he'd say, loading his rifle and grinning. So, when he didn't come back one cold Sunday night, I knew something was wrong. It started like any other hunting trip. He kissed his wife, Sarah, on the cheek, ruffled his son's hair, and told me to have the coffee ready when he got back. I laughed, told him he'd be lucky if I didn't drink it all before he showed up. Then he was gone, his orange vest disappearing into the trees. When the sun went down and he still wasn't back, Sarah called me. She was worried, but not panicked, not yet. He probably lost track of time, she said, though her voice was tight. You know how he is. I grabbed a flashlight and headed out. The wind had picked up, carrying the kind of cold that bites deep. The snow underfoot was crusty, crunching with every step. I followed the trail he always used, calling his name. No answer, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. I should have gone back when the flashlight started flickering, but I didn't. I kept walking, my boots sinking into the snow, my breath steaming in the air. That's when I found his footprints. They were deep, fresh, leading off the trail and into the denser part of the forest. Tom? I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. I followed the tracks, the beam of my flashlight bouncing off the trunks of trees. The footprints were steady at first, like he'd been walking with purpose. But then they started to stagger, veering left and right, as if he'd been unsure of where he was going. The track stopped at a tree. It was an old one, massive, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The snow around the base was untouched, pristine, but the tracks ended abruptly, like he'd vanished into thin air. My stomach churned. I circled the tree, shining my light into every crevice, calling his name until my throat was raw. Nothing. Then I heard him. It was faint at first, a muffled cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Help, help me, his voice. I'd know it anywhere. Tom. I shouted, spinning around. Where are you? Help, the voice was louder now, desperate, but it didn't make sense. It wasn't coming from the ground. It was above me. I aimed the flashlight upward, its beam slicing through the branches. There was nothing there, no sign of him, no sign of anything. Just the endless black of the sky and the skeletal fingers of the tree swaying in the wind. But the voice kept coming, each word laced with panic. Please, help me. I'm here. I should have run then, but I didn't. Something about that voice, it didn't just sound like Tom. It felt like him, like it reached into my chest and gripped my heart. I couldn't leave him. I stumbled back to Sarah's house, breathless and shaking. She was waiting on the porch, her face pale, her arms crossed tight against the cold. Did you find him? She asked, her voice trembling. I told her what I'd heard. I expected her to call me crazy, but she didn't. She just stared at me, her eyes wide, and said, "We need to call someone." The search team arrived the next morning. Local volunteers, a few park rangers. They brought dogs, flashlights, even a drone. We led them to the tree, and I felt a flicker of hope. They'd find him. They had to. The dog stopped barking as soon as we reached the tree. They whimpered and pulled back, tails tucked between their legs. The handlers tried to urge them forward, but they refused. One of the rangers muttered something under his breath, crossing himself. We spread out, combing the area. Every so often, someone would call his name, but the forest swallowed the sound. I stayed near the tree, circling it, staring up into the branches. That's when I heard it again. Help me. This time, it wasn't faint. It was clear, as if he was standing right next to me. I shouted for the others, but when they came running, the voice was gone. They looked at me like I was losing it. Maybe I was. Hours turned into days. The search team didn't find anything, not a boot, not a scrap of orange fabric. Nothing. But the voice didn't stop. Every time I went back to that tree, I heard it. Sometimes it was a whisper, other times a scream. It always came from above. I started dreaming about the tree. In the dreams, its branches twisted and writhed like snakes, and something was inside it, something dark and pulsing. I'd wake up gasping for air, Tom's voice ringing in my ears. The rangers called off the search after a week. Sometimes the forest doesn't give them back, one of them said, his voice heavy. Sarah was devastated, of course. She tried to move on, for her son's sake, but I could see it eating at her. I thought about telling her what I'd been hearing, but how could I? She'd think I was crazy. But I wasn't crazy. I know what I heard. Last night, I went back to the tree. I couldn't help myself. The snow was falling lightly, the kind that looks pretty but hides the ice underneath. My flashlight cast long shadows as I approached. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. Tom? I whispered, my voice cracking. Help me. His voice was louder than ever, raw with pain. It was coming from above, just like before. But this time, I saw something. A faint glow, high up in the branches. I climbed. The bark was rough under my hands, the branches slick with ice. I don't know why I kept going, but I couldn't stop. The glow grew brighter the higher I climbed, until it surrounded me, blinding. And then I saw it. Tom. He was tangled in the branches, his body twisted, his face pale. But his eyes were open, staring at me. His lips moved, forming the words I'd been hearing for days. Help me. Please. I reached for him, but the branches shifted, curling around his body, pulling him deeper into the tree. He screamed, and the sound shattered something inside me. The glow faded, and I was left clinging to the trunk, the wind howling around me. I don't remember climbing down. I don't remember walking back to my truck. All I know is that I can't stop hearing his voice. It follows me everywhere, echoing in my head, begging for help I can't give. The Adirondacks are beautiful, they say. Peaceful. But now I know the truth. Some places aren't meant for the living. Some places belong to the dead. And some trees are hungry. Story number 5. The Midnight Chime. I didn't want to move back to Salem. Who would? The town clings to its past like a stubborn ghost, every cobblestone street and creaky, leaning house a reminder of horrors dressed up as history. But after my parents passed, the house fell to me, their only child, and something about leaving it to rot felt like letting them go all over again. So, in the dead of January, I packed my life into a U-Haul and made the long drive from Boston back to the town I swore I'd never return to. The house was just as I remembered it. A hulking, sagging thing at the edge of town, shrouded by oaks that swayed like skeletons in the winter wind. It had been in my family for generations, though no one could tell me exactly how long. Built in the 1600s, my dad used to say, with a gleam of pride that never quite masked the unease in his voice. The house had character, sure, but it also had secrets. You could feel them in the walls, in the groan of the floorboards, in the way the air turned cold at the top of the stairs. I tried to ignore the unease as I unpacked, convincing myself that the hollow ache in my chest was grief, not dread. The first few nights were uneventful. The house was drafty, the pipes moaned, and the ancient heater barely kept the chill at bay, but it was nothing I couldn't handle. I told myself I'd get used to it, that it would feel like home eventually. Then came the bell. It started on the 4th night, just after midnight. A faint chime, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. I was in bed, half asleep, when it drifted up from the basement. I sat up, straining to listen, but it didn't come again. Just the wind outside, rattling the windows. The next night, it happened again. This time, I was wide awake. I'd been lying in bed, scrolling mindlessly on my phone, when the sound floated up through the floorboards, a single, clear note, like a bell struck gently in the dark. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. It was deliberate. I told myself it was nothing. An old house makes noise, I thought. Maybe a draft had knocked something over, or maybe I'd left something on downstairs. But when I went to check, the house was silent, the basement door locked as always. By the third night, I couldn't ignore it. The bell rang again, just after midnight, and this time it wasn't just one chime. It rang 3 times, evenly spaced, each note slicing through the silence like a blade. I sat in bed, paralyzed, my mind racing. It wasn't random. It was a signal. I don't know why I went downstairs. Maybe it was morbid curiosity, or maybe it was the gnawing need to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. I grabbed a flashlight, pulled on a sweater, and crept down the stairs, my breath fogging in the freezing air. The basement door stood at the end of the hall, its frame warped with age. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the knob. The bell rang again, louder this time, as if daring me to open the door. I swallowed hard and twisted the knob. The basement smelled of damp earth and mildew, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, landing on shelves stacked with dusty jars and crates. I scanned the room, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just the usual clutter, and in the corner, a tall grandfather clock. The clock hadn't worked in years. Its brass pendulum hung motionless, tarnished with age, and the hands were stuck at 3:15, the same time they'd been stuck since I was a kid. But as I approached, the air seemed to grow heavier, the silence pressing down on me like a weight. The bell rang again, and this time I saw it, the hands of the clock twitching, moving, inching their way toward midnight. I stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in my grip. My reflection in the glass face of the clock looked distorted, stretched, like a funhouse mirror. And then, behind me, I saw her. She stood in the shadows, half hidden by the clutter, her dress a faded gray that might have been white once. Her hair was long and loose, her face pale, her eyes hollow and accusing. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her presence was suffocating. I turned, heart racing, but the space behind me was empty. When I looked back at the clock, the reflection was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on, clutching a cup of coffee that went cold in my hands. The clock chimed again at midnight the following night, and the night after that, always the same 3 chimes, always followed by the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to leave. Packed a bag, threw it in the car, and drove toward the highway. But as soon as I hit the town limits, the car stalled. Dead battery, or so I thought. A tow truck brought me back to the house, and when I stepped inside, the clock was waiting, its hands frozen at 3:15, the pendulum swaying gently as if it had been set in motion by an invisible hand. I started researching the house. Digging through old records, poring over books at the library. What I found made my skin crawl. The house had belonged to a woman named Abigail Blackwood, accused of witchcraft during the Salem trials. She was hanged in 1692, but not before cursing the town and everyone who had betrayed her. Her family stayed in the house for generations, but tragedy seemed to follow them: fires, drownings, disappearances. The bell, I learned, had been hers. A silver bell she'd used during seances, or so the stories claimed. It had vanished after her death, but some said you could still hear it ringing on cold, dark nights. The sightings became more frequent. Abigail appeared in mirrors, in windows, in the corner of my vision. She never spoke, but her presence was a constant, oppressive weight. I started to dream about her, dreams where I was the one on the gallows, the noose tightening around my neck as she watched from the crowd, her lips curled into a cold smile. The final night, the clock struck midnight, and the basement door opened on its own. The bell rang, louder than ever, its chime echoing through the house. I went downstairs, unable to stop myself, as if drawn by an invisible force. Abigail was waiting. She stood by the clock, her eyes locked on mine. Her hand reached out, and I felt a cold, sharp pain in my chest, like claws sinking into my heart. I don't remember what happened next. I woke up on the floor, the bell silent, the clock frozen once again at 3:15. But the air in the house felt different, heavier, darker. She was still there. I could feel her. I left Salem the next morning, abandoning the house and everything in it. But the bell followed me. Every night at midnight, I hear it, faint and distant, calling me back. I know what she wants. She wants me to remember, to see, to feel what she felt. And someday, I know I will. Because you can't escape Salem. The past always finds you, no matter how far you run. Story number 6. The White Road. Route 66 in January is no place for the faint-hearted. Snowstorms roll in fast, turning the historic highway into a white void where even the faintest road markings vanish beneath layers of ice and snow. But truckers don't get to call in weather days. The load has to move, no matter what. I've driven through worse, I told myself. I was wrong. The storm started as a light flurry when I left Amarillo, Texas, heading east toward Oklahoma City. By the time I crossed the border into Oklahoma, the snow was coming down in sheets, thick and relentless, swallowing my headlights. The CB radio crackled with warnings from other drivers, but I pressed on. The delivery was due by morning, and I had hours of highway left to cover. The wind howled, shaking the cab of my truck as I gripped the wheel tighter, squinting to make out the faint traces of the road ahead. The world outside was a swirling blur of white, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones no matter how high you cranked the heat. I told myself it was just another storm. Keep the truck moving, and you'll get through it. Then I saw her. She appeared out of the storm, standing on the shoulder of the highway, her figure barely visible through the snow. At first, I thought she was a shadow, a trick of the headlights bouncing off the drifts. But as I drew closer, her outline sharpened, slim and frail, wrapped in a coat too thin for the weather. She stood perfectly still, one hand raised as if to flag me down. I should have kept driving. Every instinct screamed at me to press the gas and leave her behind, but I couldn't. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was the thought of her freezing to death out there. Or maybe it was something deeper, something I couldn't explain. Either way, I pulled over. The snow crunched under my boots as I stepped out of the cab, the wind biting at my face. "Ma'am?" I called, my voice barely carrying over the storm. She didn't respond, just stood there, her back to me. "Ma'am, it's freezing out here. Do you need a ride?" She turned slowly, her movement stiff and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. Her face came into view, pale and sharp, her eyes dark hollows that seemed to swallow the light. She didn't look at me, she looked through me. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and distant, like a breeze rustling through dead leaves. I opened the passenger door, and she climbed in without another word. As soon as the door shut, the temperature in the cab plummeted. The heater was blasting, but the air felt icy, like stepping into a freezer. My breath fogged the windshield, and I rubbed my hands together, trying to shake the chill. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed straight ahead, unblinking. Her hands rested in her lap, pale and motionless. The miles crawled by in silence. The snow continued to fall, the road disappearing beneath a blanket of white. I glanced at her every so often, but she didn't move. Something about her made my skin crawl. She was too still, too quiet, like a statue. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. She wasn't there. My heart slammed against my ribs. I whipped my head around, but she was still sitting in the passenger seat, her dark eyes staring into the storm. My hands tightened on the wheel, my knuckles white. I flicked my gaze back to the mirror. Nothing. Just an empty seat. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice shaking. She didn't respond. The radio crackled, a burst of static that made me jump. Through the hiss, I caught fragments of a voice, low and garbled. I turned the dial, but the static only grew louder, drowning out the faint whispers. "Turn back," a voice whispered, clear as day. My blood ran cold. I slammed the radio off and focused on the road, my pulse hammering in my ears. The temperature in the cab continued to drop, frost creeping along the inside of the windows. My breath hung in the air, thick and heavy, as if the cab were filling with smoke. Then she spoke. "They left me here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at her, my throat tight. "What do you mean?" "They left me in the cold," she said, her head turning slowly to face me. Her eyes met mine, and I felt like I was falling, sinking into an abyss. "They didn't come back." "Who?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Who left you?" She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled, a slow, cold curl of her lips that sent a shiver down my spine. Her teeth were too sharp, too white, like the glint of a blade in the dark. The truck lurched, skidding on the ice. I fought the wheel, my heart pounding as the cab fishtailed. When I regained control, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, the frost melting from the windows. The air warmed slightly, but my hands were still trembling as I gripped the wheel. I should have stopped. I should have pulled over and called someone, anyone, but I didn't. I kept driving, my eyes darting to the mirrors, half expecting her to reappear. The storm began to ease, the snow thinning, and I could just make out the faint glow of a gas station ahead. I pulled in, desperate for warmth, for human contact. The attendant looked up as I stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as he took in my pale face and shaking hands. "You all right?" he asked. I think I picked someone up on the road," I stammered. "A woman. She just disappeared." The man's face darkened. He set down the magazine he'd been reading and leaned closer. "Route 66? I nodded. He let out a long breath, shaking his head. "You're not the first. Folks around here talk about a woman who stands by the road during storms. Been stories like that for decades. Some say she died out there, froze to death when her car broke down. Others say she's still looking for a ride, to nowhere." I stared at him, my mouth dry. "What happens to the people who pick her up?" The man shrugged, his expression grim. "Most don't make it far. If you're lucky, she just vanishes. If you're not," he trailed off, his eyes drifting to the window, where the storm raged on. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the gas station parking lot until the sun rose, too afraid to get back on the road. When I finally worked up the courage to leave, the snow had stopped, and the world was eerily quiet. I don't take Route 66 anymore, not in winter, not ever. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind howls outside my window, I think about her, about the chill in the cab, the emptiness in the mirror, and the smile that still haunts my dreams. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled. And some passengers are better left behind. Story number 7. The Forgotten Birthday. The morning of my 33rd birthday started with an odd, sinking feeling, the kind that claws at the edge of your mind but refuses to show its face. Chicago was locked in a deep freeze, the January wind howling outside my apartment like an animal trying to claw its way in. I told myself it was just the weather, the gray skies pressing down on me. But deep down, I knew better. I'd sent out invitations weeks ago. A small gathering, just a handful of friends. Pizza, drinks, nothing fancy. I even reminded everyone with a group text 2 days prior. But as the clock ticked toward 7 p.m., the time I told them to come, my phone remained stubbornly silent. At first, I tried to brush it off. People are late, I thought. It's cold. Maybe they're stuck in traffic. But as the minutes turned into hours, the truth began to settle in my chest like a stone. No one was coming. Not a single person. By 9 p.m., I'd given up pretending otherwise. The balloons I'd hung up sagged pathetically, and the cake I'd spent way too much money on sat untouched on the counter. I poured myself a glass of wine, sinking onto the couch with my phone in hand. No new messages, no missed calls. Just the endless scroll of other people's lives on social media, each post a reminder of how alone I was. Then the knock came. It startled me, sharp and insistent against the silence. My heart leapt, a flicker of hope igniting in my chest. Maybe someone had remembered after all. I hurried to the door, brushing my hair back, trying to look less pathetic than I felt. But when I opened it, no one was there. Just a small box, neatly wrapped in silver paper, sitting on the welcome mat. I looked up and down the hall, but it was empty. The air was still, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly above. I bent down, hesitating for a moment before picking it up. The box was cold, almost unnaturally so, and heavier than it looked. I carried it inside, setting it on the coffee table. There was no card, no name, nothing to indicate who had sent it. My fingers trembled slightly as I tugged at the ribbon, peeling back the wrapping paper. Inside was a small wooden box, its surface smooth and polished, with a single word carved into the lid, "Remember." I hesitated, the weight in my chest growing heavier. Something about the box felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, like I shouldn't be touching it. But curiosity won out. It always does. I opened the lid. Inside was a card, plain white with a single sentence scrawled in black ink, "Don't forget me." My breath caught in my throat. The handwriting was familiar, too familiar. I picked up the card, and that's when I saw what lay beneath it. A necklace. A simple chain with a small pendant shaped like a crescent moon. My stomach twisted. I knew that necklace. I'd given it to Claire for her birthday, years ago. She'd worn it every day after that, until she disappeared. Claire. My best friend, my partner in crime, the one person who had understood me better than anyone else. She'd vanished 10 years ago, on a cold January night just like this one. No warning, no note, no trace. The police said she must have run away, but I never believed that. Claire wouldn't have left me. Not like that. I stared at the necklace, my mind racing. How had it ended up here? Who could have sent it? My chest tightened, memories rushing back in a flood, laughter over late-night movies, whispered secrets shared in the dark, the sound of her voice calling my name. And then, the last time I saw her, walking into the snowstorm, her silhouette fading into the white. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows stretching long and strange. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. The screen lit up with a notification, an email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "Do you remember?" My hands shook as I opened it. The body of the email was blank, except for an attachment. A photo. I clicked it, and my blood ran cold. It was Claire, standing in my living room, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and sunken. She was wearing the necklace, her lips curled into a faint, eerie smile. And behind her, the balloons I'd hung up for my party swayed gently, as if someone had just walked past them. I stumbled back, my breath coming in short gasps. The room felt colder, the air pressing against me like an icy hand. The shadows seemed to ripple, and for a moment I thought I saw movement in the corner of my eye. I turned, but nothing was there. "Don't forget me," a voice whispered. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Claire's voice. The lights flickered, and the wine glass on the coffee table tipped over, spilling red liquid across the surface. The shadows in the room grew darker, deeper, swallowing the corners of the space. My reflection in the window stared back at me, but it wasn't quite right. The eyes were too dark, the smile too wide. The whispers grew louder, overlapping, filling the room with a cacophony of sound. Memories I didn't want to remember flashed through my mind, Claire's hand slipping from mine as we argued in the snow, her voice rising in anger, her figure retreating into the storm. The sound of her footsteps fading, and then, silence. I sank to my knees, clutching the necklace in my hand. "I'm sorry," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm so sorry." The room fell silent. The shadows stopped moving, the light steadying. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I felt it, a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned slowly, and there she was. Claire. Her face was inches from mine, her breath cold against my skin. Her eyes were empty, her expression a mask of sadness and anger. "You forgot me," she said, her voice trembling. "You let me go." "I didn't mean to," I choked out. "I didn't." "You did," she whispered, her fingers tightening on my shoulder. "And now, you'll never forget." The lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. Her face was the last thing I saw, her eyes burning into mine. And then, nothing. I woke up hours later, sprawled on the living room floor. The box, the card, the necklace, everything was gone. The apartment was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the heater struggling against the cold. But I knew she was still there. I could feel her, just out of sight, watching, waiting. Every year on my birthday, I hear her voice. Soft, insistent, calling me back to that night. Reminding me of what I lost and what I can never escape. Some memories don't fade. Some ghosts never leave. Story number 8. Frosted Shadows. When I arrived at Denver University that January, the cold bit harder than I expected. I'd grown up in New Mexico, where winters were chilly but forgiving. Colorado was different. The air had teeth, the kind that sank deep and stayed there. Still, I'd gotten a scholarship, and the dorm room was cheap, too cheap, really. I should have asked why. The building was ancient, an old Victorian brick structure that had been retrofitted into student housing decades ago. They called it Hollis Hall, though most students just called it the Crypt. The nickname wasn't meant to be ironic, it was genuinely freezing in there. Every hallway seemed to carry a draft, no matter how high the heating was turned up. My room was on the 3rd floor, a small single with a narrow bed, a desk, and a radiator that clanked like it was on its last legs. The window faced the street, and through it, I could see the pale January sky and the snow blanketing the city below. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt it, the cold. Not just the kind of cold you could fight off with a sweater, but a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep up through the floorboards and settle into your skin. I fiddled with the radiator, but it was already on full blast. Still, the air felt like ice. I unpacked quickly, trying to keep moving to stay warm. My mom had sent me with a heated blanket, and I was grateful for it. By the time night fell, I was curled up on the bed with the blanket wrapped around me, trying to ignore the occasional creaks and groans of the old building. I told myself it was just settling noises, but the sound carried an eerie, hollow quality that made me shiver. It wasn't until the 3rd night that I found the letter. I was rearranging my desk, trying to make room for my laptop, when one of the floorboards beneath the chair squeaked loudly. At first, I thought it was just loose, but when I pressed on it, it popped up slightly, revealing a gap beneath. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pried it up the rest of the way. Inside the gap was a single envelope, yellowed with age and brittle at the edges. The handwriting on the front was elegant, cursive, and old-fashioned. It simply said, "To whoever finds this." I hesitated, a cold knot forming in my stomach. The air seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the room darker. But I opened it. The letter was short, written in the same cursive hand. "If you're reading this, you're in danger. My name was Abigail Carter, and I lived in this room during the winter of 1978. I don't know how it started, but the cold came first. No matter how high the heat was turned up, the room stayed freezing. Then came the dreams. Dreams of being trapped in ice, unable to move, unable to breathe. I woke up one morning and couldn't feel my hands or feet. I thought it was just the cold, but it wasn't. The cold wasn't just in the air, it was inside me. They found me frozen to death in this room. But I didn't leave. I can't. If you stay here, neither will you. Get out while you can." I dropped the letter as though it had burned me, my hands shaking. The words echoed in my mind, "I can't. If you stay here, neither will you." I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear creeping up my spine. It had to be a prank, right? Someone's idea of a joke to scare new residents. But when I looked down at my hands, I noticed something that made my breath catch. They were pale, almost blue, and shaking violently. My fingertips felt numb, as if I'd been holding a block of ice. I grabbed my heated blanket, wrapping it tightly around myself, but the chill didn't go away. That night, I dreamed of ice. In the dream, I was lying on my bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to move. My breath came out in visible puffs, and frost spread across the walls, crawling like vines. The room was filled with a low, humming noise, almost like a chant. Then I saw her. She stood in the corner, her face obscured by long, dark hair, her body wrapped in a tattered winter coat. Her hands were blue, the skin cracked and blistered, her breath coming out in wisps of white fog. She didn't speak. She just stared at me, her head tilting slightly, as if trying to decide what to do with me. When I woke up, my fingers were numb again, my toes stiff and aching. I stumbled out of bed, grabbing my phone to check the time. It was 3:12 a.m. The room was darker than it should have been, the window frosted over so thickly that no light from the street lamps outside could seep through. The radiator was silent, the air frigid. I told myself it was just a dream, but the fear lingered. Every night after that, the dreams returned. Abigail was always there, always watching. Sometimes, I felt her breath on my neck, cold and sharp, like the bite of winter wind. Sometimes, I heard her whispering, her voice faint but filled with despair. The cold in the room grew worse. My heated blanket stopped working, the radiator gave out completely, and no matter how many layers I wore, I couldn't stop shivering. I started avoiding the dorm as much as I could, spending long hours in the library or the campus cafe, anywhere that wasn't Hollis Hall. But every night, I had to go back. And every night, she was waiting. The final straw came 2 weeks after I found the letter. I woke up to the sound of whispering, dozens of voices, faint and overlapping, like the wind carrying secrets through a forest. My breath fogged the air as I sat up, and my heart nearly stopped. The walls were covered in frost, patterns etched into the ice like claw marks. My bed was frozen to the floor, and my body felt heavy, sluggish, as though the cold had seeped into my bones. And there, standing at the foot of my bed, was Abigail. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, her lips cracked and blue. She opened her mouth, and a rush of icy wind filled the room, carrying with it the sound of her voice, "You didn't leave. Now you're mine." I don't know how I got out of that room. The next thing I remember, I was standing outside in my pajamas, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my fingers so cold they were nearly useless. The RA found me and took me to the campus health center, where they treated me for mild frostbite. I didn't tell them what had happened. Who would believe me? I never went back to that dorm. My things are probably still in there, frozen to the floor. I moved off campus, taking a cramped studio apartment miles away from Hollis Hall. Sometimes, I still dream of ice. I still feel the cold creeping in, wrapping around me like a shroud. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I hear her voice, faint and distant, whispering from somewhere just out of sight. You didn't leave. Now you're mine. Story number 9. The Cursed Bridge. Stowe, Vermont, was supposed to be the perfect honeymoon destination. Fresh snow blanketed the mountains, the smell of pine hung thick in the air, and the town itself looked like something out of a Hallmark card. Annie had wanted a winter wedding, and I had wanted her to be happy. So here we were, bundled in our warmest clothes, holding hands as we wandered through the quaint streets, surrounded by tourists snapping photos and locals wishing us well. On the second day, Annie suggested we visit Gold Brook Bridge. The locals called it Emily's Bridge, after some old ghost story. Apparently, a woman named Emily had thrown herself off it in the 1800s after her fiancé jilted her. I didn't pay much attention to the details. Ghost stories weren't my thing, but Annie loved that sort of thing. She laughed about the whole idea, calling it deliciously creepy. The bridge was easy to find, a covered wooden structure that stretched over a narrow stream, tucked away at the edge of the woods. It was old but sturdy, the kind of place you'd expect to see in a black and white postcard. The snow was falling lightly as we arrived, and the world felt quiet, muffled by the thick layer of white. Perfect for a photo, Annie said, pulling out her phone. She snapped a few pictures of the bridge, then handed the phone to me. Take one of me. I obliged, watching her pose in front of the bridge, her red scarf bright against the gray sky. Her laugh echoed through the cold air, a warm, happy sound that made me smile despite myself. She looked so alive, so vibrant. I didn't know how wrong everything would go. We wandered onto the bridge, marveling at the way the wooden beams framed the view of the frozen stream below. The planks creaked under our boots, and a faint draft seeped through the gaps, carrying with it the faint scent of damp wood and something metallic. Do you hear that? Annie asked suddenly, stopping in the middle of the bridge. Hear what? She tilted her head, listening. Singing. It sounds like children. I strained to hear, but at first, all I caught was the sound of the wind whistling through the beams. Then, faintly, I heard it too. A soft, lilting melody, carried on the breeze like the echoes of a nursery rhyme. Maybe it's someone in the woods, I said, though the words felt hollow. There was no one else around. Annie stepped closer to the edge, peering over the railing. It's coming from down there, she said, pointing to the stream below. The bridge creaked as I joined her, looking down. The water was dark, barely visible beneath a crust of ice. Snowflakes drifted down, melting as they touched the surface. "Hello?" Annie called, her voice bouncing off the wooden beams. The singing stopped. We both froze, the sudden silence pressing down on us like a weight. And then, as if in response, the water rippled. "Did you see that?" Annie whispered, her hand gripping my arm. Before I could answer, the singing started again, louder this time, and with it came something else, a reflection. At first, I thought it was just us, our images mirrored in the dark water below. But as I looked closer, I realized it wasn't right. The reflections were moving, but not in time with us. Annie gasped, her nails digging into my arm. That's us," she stammered, her voice trembling. She was right. The figures in the water were us, but not as we were now. They were pale, bloated, their faces twisted in expressions of terror. Ice clung to their hair and clothes, their lips blue, their eyes wide and staring. I could see the scarf around the reflection of Annie's neck, but it was torn and frayed, like it had been dragged through water. "Let's go," I said, my voice shaking. I grabbed her hand and pulled her back toward the center of the bridge. But the singing grew louder, the melody twisting into something discordant, something wrong. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that burns your skin, and the light seemed to dim, as though the snow itself was swallowing the world. "We have to leave," I said again, but Annie wasn't moving. She was staring at the water, her face pale, her lips moving silently. "Annie!" I shouted, shaking her. She blinked, as though waking from a dream, and looked at me with wide, frightened eyes. "It was pulling me," she whispered. I could feel it pulling me. I didn't ask what she meant. I didn't want to know. I grabbed her hand and practically dragged her off the bridge. The moment we stepped off, the singing stopped, and the air grew warmer, the world brighter. But the silence that followed was almost worse. Neither of us spoke as we trudged back to the car. Annie was shaking, her hands clutching the scarf around her neck as though trying to reassure herself it was still there. That night, she had nightmares. She woke up screaming, her skin clammy with sweat, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "They were drowning me," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They had my scarf, and they were pulling me under." I held her until she fell back asleep, but I didn't sleep at all. I couldn't shake the image of our reflections, the way they had looked up at us with those lifeless eyes, as though warning us, or maybe inviting us to join them. The next morning, we packed up and left Stowe. Annie didn't protest, didn't ask to stay longer. She just stared out the window as we drove, her face pale, her hands clutching her scarf like a lifeline. I've tried to forget what happened on that bridge, but I can't. Every time I close my eyes, I see our reflections, hear the haunting melody of the singing. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can feel the cold, bony grip of unseen hands tugging at me, pulling me toward the water. They say bridges are liminal spaces, places where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. I used to think that was just folklore, stories to scare kids. But now I know the truth. Some places don't let go. Some places pull you under.